All right, back by popular demand. Welcome to another very entertaining video. This one is all about autonomic nervous system. And as the name kind of implies, this is something that we typically don't think about it simply because it happens automatically. Now, oftentimes people struggle to wrap their heads around what that actually means. What am I actually controlling in my body that I'm really not thinking about, but that has to happen? And I think a really great way to illustrate this point is simply to expose you to a new environment. Here we've got two very different environments. One, tasty, delectable. You start to salivate. Can you feel your salivary glands start to contract and your mouth is full of saliva and you're thinking about how good that's going to taste? The other one, kind of a vicious looking bear. You might feel excited about that, but your heart rate's probably going up. Thinking, man, if I ever come in contact with that in real life, I've got to run for my life, right? These are kind of the contrasting environments that the autonomic system is suited to respond to, something that we don't have to think about. We're going to come back and compare and contrast these two environments in just a second. But first, I'd like to just highlight where we are in the grand scheme of things. So we've talked previously, remember, we've got the central nervous system. We've got the peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, we have sensory. A key part of what sensory does is provide information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system processes that information and decides to execute in some way. And that execution will typically involve a motor component. So we've seen this before. We can break motor down into a couple of different types, where we've got somatic. And now what we're going to be talking about today, autonomic. The somatic is all about skeletal muscle. We've talked about the neuromuscular junction. We've talked about sarcomeres. We've talked about all those things that go into understanding somatic skeletal muscle. And what we want to start to focus on now with this autonomic system, we're going to branch into two more subdivisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And where the somatic system was focused on skeletal muscle, for both of these, what are we looking at? We're looking primarily at smooth muscle and to some extent cardiac muscle. So this kind of gives you a big picture. Sensory still coming in. We're processing that information. Choosing to act, to exercise skeletal muscle is one thing, but the things that happen behind the scene regarding smooth muscle and cardiac muscle is all autonomic, and this is what the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are all about. So let's go back and compare those two contrasting environments with the delicious plate of nachos and the frightening bear. All right, we separated these two images, one on the right, one on the left. Recognize both of these are the autonomic system, right? Over here, we've got the parasympathetic. This is typically associated with, in the context of, you might hear, rest and digest. However, on this side, we have the sympathetic. This is all about fight, flight, or in some cases, flee. Run away, run away. And I find it very useful as I begin to understand how these two systems work. Number one, this is not an on-off switch. A better way to describe this is maybe with a teeter-totter. So if we have a teeter-totter, I want you to understand that to get this side up, if this side, for example, represents the sympathetic side, to get that side up, I can do two things. I can increase parasympathetic activity, or I can decrease sympathetic activity, right? So there's a balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. They're always on, but which one is on more? To get a sympathetic response, I can either increase sympathetic activity or decrease parasympathetic activity. And both of those would lead to an imbalance toward the sympathetic and give a sympathetic response. So as we think about that, let's now take these two images, these two environments, the scary bear, the delicious plate of nachos, and let's go organ by organ through the organs that are going to have the most profound effect. This exercise, I think, is useful in determining what an organ is going to do, because mostly it's intuitive. These are things that we've already thought about, that we already understand. All right, first setup, the lungs. And we ask ourselves, what do I want the lungs to do if I'm running from a bear? Well, the obvious answer is if I'm running really hard, I want to be able to fill my lungs to a greater capacity. I want to be able to breathe easier, quicker. I want to bring more air in. However, if I'm eating a plate of nachos, I really don't care how much air I'm bringing in. It requires very little effort to sit down and eat. And in reality, you might think, well, why don't I just leave the lungs open all the time? Well, there's maintenance that has to take place. I don't want to dry anything out. If things are wide open, then I'm bringing in a lot of contaminants, a lot of pollution. So it's actually easier to maintain in a more closed and restricted setting. And so if we look at the sympathetic response, what do we want to do? Okay, so running from a bear, what do I want? I want to be able to move a lot of air. How do we do that? Well, that's simple. If we take a cross-section through one of these bronchioles, maybe right there, let's take a cross-section. Maybe it looked like that. Well, we want to open it up. This process is called bronchodilation. And how does it happen? Well, this is smooth muscle. This is smooth muscle relaxing. And I hope you can appreciate what that looks like, right? A smooth muscle is kind of wrapped around these bronchioles like a rubber band. I want the smooth muscle to relax, to not squeeze so tight. And that allows for the bronchiole itself to expand and allow increased airflow. If we contrast that with what's going on with the nachos, like I said, it's much easier to maintain, to keep things clean and moist and prevent drying out if things are small. I don't need to move a lot of air, so moving through that small bronchiole is perfect for me. This is bronchoconstriction. And based on our last example, I hope you can appreciate that this is all about smooth muscle constriction, right? This smooth muscle is going to constrict, it's going to squeeze, and that's why this tube is getting smaller. Now, this brings up an important point, because a lot of times when people have in their minds fight or flight, this is all stimulatory, it's activation, right? I'm going to stimulate you, whereas the comatose state that's associated with nachos, you're like, no, I'm not stimulated in any way. I'm just trying to burn off brain cells so that I can go to sleep, right? But this highlights a key point. When we think about relaxation, anytime I'm relaxing smooth muscle, this is an inhibitory signal. And this is going to be an important thing that we'll talk about in the future. I just bring this up to recognize fight or flight's not all about stimulation. It depends on the tissue we're talking about. And we have to understand what the muscle is doing. Is the muscle relaxing or is the muscle contracting? And we see over here in a relaxed state as we eat nachos, the muscle is actually contracting. This is a constricted state. So this is a stimulation of this smooth muscle. And we'll revisit this theme. All right, let's jump down to the next organ. The next one on our list is the heart. We're talking about nachos, right? What's going on with the heart? Well, our EKG looks like this. If we draw this trace, we've got our P wave, we got our QRS complex, like this, then our T wave, and then we have a long delay until we get another P wave, and there's another QRS complex, and then our T wave. Right? And remember, this gap from here to here, that is our heart rate. And so with a parasympathetic response, we have decreased heart rate. Let's contrast that with what's going on when we're running from a bear. I think this is pretty obvious. What does our new trace look like? Looks like this, right? You get the idea where, look at our heart rate now. The distance from here to here to here, our heart rate is significantly elevated. In this case, we see that this is going to be a stimulatory response. And so even though both of these were fight or flight, we saw an inhibitory response with the lungs, with the bronchioles, because we had to relax the smooth muscle. But here we're stimulating cardiac muscle to go faster. All right, as we look at the rest of these organs, let's pull them up. We've got the gut and everything associated with excretions. The perfect example here is hide and seek, right? You're really excited, you're playing hide and seek, you're having a great time, and somebody starts counting, and you're running, you find the perfect hiding spot, and you settle down, and you're trying to be quiet, and then, wait for it, you gotta pee, right? You didn't have to pee 30 seconds earlier, but now you really gotta pee. Why? That's the idea behind the sympathetic and parasympathetic response. And so the sympathetic response, decreased gut motility, And by motility, I just mean activation, right? The bowels are moving. We got peristaltic contractions. I don't really need to go to the bathroom. But the minute I rest and digest, this is the time where all of these things start to be turned on, increased motility. Okay, these last two are a little bit different. We're going to break a few of the rules. For blood vessels, right? That's what this is. This is a blood vessel. And specifically, we're talking about the arteriolar side because that's where we have smooth muscle. We see increased constriction. Now, this serves two purposes. Number one, this is going to lead to increased blood pressure. This is going to help deliver blood where I need it to, skeletal muscle, and that's important. Number two, this helps shunt blood away from the gut and toward the skeletal muscle where I need it most. So I directionally flow the blood to where I need it in the muscles that are performing the fight or flight response. Because I've shut down my gut motility, I don't need a lot of blood going to my gut. I'm not worried about food digestion. But interestingly, for the most part, parasympathetics don't innervate blood vessels. There are some exceptions, including some of the arteries of the heart and erectile tissue, but other than that, we don't see a parasympathetic response. Everything associated with blood vessels is done by sympathetic tone. This is also true for this next system. What we've got drawn here is a sweat gland. Now, what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about generalized. These are the sweat glands that cover my body that help regulate thermal homeostasis, right? They're regulating body temperature. This is not talking about my axial sweat glands, right? The sweat glands that I have specifically in the axial region of the armpit or the pubic area. Those serve a different purpose. This is just generalized sweat glands that we're talking about here. They're also under control only of the sympathetic system. In other words, no parasympathetics. And of course, we understand what's going on, right? In a fight or flight response, maybe, you're on a date and your date is, you're kind of nervous about this whole thing and you're kind of wishing you could fight or maybe flee. And anyway, you're getting really nervous here. And so what would you expect to see? Increased constriction. So this is going to lead to increased sweating. This is a stimulatory response. But here's the key here. These are using muscarinic receptors. That probably doesn't mean anything to you right now, but we're going to come back to that. The muscarinic receptor is actually a parasympathetic receptor, but it's a sympathetic system except for that. Why we have that slight change hopefully will become a little bit more evident as we talk about this further. But let's zoom out and kind of take a look at where we're at, right? The autonomic branch is a branch of the motor response driven by the CNS, and it can be broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. We compare sympathetic to this fight or flight response where, for whatever reason, we're excited. This is exercise, this is running from a bear, compared to the sympathetic where it's all rest and digest. And we're thinking about what these visceral organs are doing in response to these different scenarios, where we have bronchodilation versus bronchoconstriction. We have increased heart rate versus decreased heart rate. We have decreased gut motility versus increased gut motility, and etc. One thing that we didn't throw on this that we could add, right? What about the pupils of the eyes? I see a bear, my pupils get really, 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 really big, right? Because I want to bring in as much information as possible as I look for an escape route. But if I'm just sitting down eating nachos and binging on Netflix, my pupils are really constricted. I'm focused. And so this is another example of how we need to think about all the different responses associated with sympathetic and parasympathetic and how it really is this teeter-totter where it's a balance between the two. It's not an on-off switch for either of these. It's a balance between the two that gives me my overall response.